welcome. There is nothing that needs doing right now. Whatever the evening has been, it is settling into the background now, and the background is where it belongs. The room is whatever temperature it is, the blanket is fine, the pillow is fine, all of it is fine. What we are going to do right now is very simple. We are going to describe slowly and in detail what ordinary daily life looked like for ordinary people who were not soldiers, who stayed at home during the First World War, who got on with the unremarkable business of living through one of the most significant events in human history, while doing the shopping and tending the garden, and going to bed at a reasonable hour. Not the dramatic version, not the terrible letters with the black border, not the white feathers and the recruiting posters, not the moments of public grief. Those things happened. But the daily version happened far more consistently, and the daily version is what we are going to describe. We are going to take our time. Let us begin in the morning, in a house in an English provincial town, in the middle years of the war, 1916 or 1917, when the initial enthusiasm had faded and the length of the war had become clear, but the end was not yet in sight. The woman who lives in this house, we will call her Dorothy, wakes in the morning as she has woken every morning for as long as she can remember. The light comes through the curtains. The sounds of the morning street outside begin. In 1916, there is no blackout in England. The systematic German bombing of English towns has begun. The Zeppelin raids, and later the Gotha bomber raids, but the blackout as a comprehensive requirement will not come until the Second World War. The curtains in Dorothy's house are her ordinary curtains, and they keep the light out until she is ready for the light. She gets up. The house is a terraced house, in a street of terraced houses, each one the same width and the same 3 stories, the same small front garden, the same arrangement of rooms, front parlour, back living room, kitchen, scullery on the ground floor, bedrooms above. The house was built in the 1880s as part of the expansion of this town during the industrial period, and it is solid and unremarkable and exactly suited to the family that lives in it. Her husband is at the front. He has been at the front for nearly 2 years. He enlisted in 1914 with the initial rush, and he has been in France since the early months of the war. His presence in the house replaced by his letters and by the photograph on the mantelpiece. She has 2 children, a boy of 12 and a girl of 9. The boy is old enough to understand something of the war, though not to be in it. He is too young to be taken seriously as a volunteer, though boys of his age were sometimes lying about their age to enlist, a fact that caused Dorothy a specific anxiety that she kept mostly to herself. The morning. The first task of the morning was the fire, though in high summer this was less pressing. In the autumn and winter the range in the kitchen had to be lit each morning, the coals laid and kindled, the oven brought to temperature for the day's cooking. The process of laying and lighting a kitchen range was one of the domestic skills that was assumed in every woman who managed a house, and which required daily execution. The coal for the fire. Coal in the First World War was not yet rationed in the formal sense of the Second World War's precise book and coupon system, but it was constrained. The war had disrupted the coal industry. Miners had enlisted in large numbers, the most able-bodied going first, and the output of the mines had declined even as the demand increased. The coal that reached civilian households was sometimes the lower-grade coal that peacetime households would have preferred not to use, and it sometimes arrived less reliably than before. Dorothy managed the coal supply carefully, not to the point of constant anxiety, but with the background awareness of the person who manages a household and knows which resources are finite. She kept an eye on the coal house in the backyard. She knew how many shovelfuls a day the range required in cold weather. She adjusted the household's use accordingly. The breakfast. Breakfast in a respectable working-class or lower-middle-class household in 1916 was simple. Porridge, perhaps, if there was oatmeal, bread and margarine and jam, tea. The bread was still available in reasonable quantity at this stage of the war, though the quality was beginning to suffer as the wheat supply was disrupted by the German submarine campaign against Atlantic shipping. The wheat. The German submarine campaign of the First World War, the unrestricted submarine warfare that was the Kaiser's strategic weapon against Britain, was targeting the supply ships that brought wheat from North America and other sources to the British population. Britain imported a significant proportion of its food, and the submarines that sank the supply ships were threatening not just the military supply chain, but the civilian food supply. The government was aware of this and was managing it through the convoy system that would eventually reduce the shipping losses to manageable levels, and through various domestic measures to reduce wheat consumption. The standard loaf in Britain became whiter as less of the wheat's outer layers were included, not because white bread was better, but because including more of the grain produced more flour from each bushel. Voluntary rationing was urged. The king and the royal family publicly committed to reduced bread consumption. Notices in churches and public places asked people to reduce their bread eating. These voluntary measures were of limited effectiveness, as voluntary measures tend to be, and formal rationing would be introduced for sugar in 1917 and meat and butter and margarine in 1918. But in 1916, the management of the household's food supply was still largely voluntary, and Dorothy managed it as a practical way of someone who understood the situation and whose income required careful management in any case. She made the breakfast. The porridge was on the range, the tea was made, the children came down, the morning routine of the children, the washing of faces, the eating of breakfast, the preparation of the school bag, the departure for school, which was 2 streets away and which they walked to without adult escort, in the way that was standard for children of this period. Dorothy's own morning then continued. The shopping. Shopping in a wartime English town in 1916 was done daily, as it had been before the war, because the cold chain that would allow food to be bought in quantity and stored for longer periods was not generally available to households without refrigeration. The daily trip to the shops was a necessity and a routine. The shops in the high street that Dorothy visited were the shops she had been visiting since before the war. The grocer, the butcher, the baker, the greengrocer. These shops were staffed differently from before the war. The young men who had been behind the counters had enlisted, and their places had been taken by older men and by women, the female shop assistant being one of the visible changes that the war had produced in the commercial life of the town. The grocer. The grocery shop in 1916 was not a self-service supermarket. It was a shop where the customer gave the shopkeeper a list or described what she needed, and the shopkeeper or his assistant assembled the items, often from the shelves or the stockroom behind the counter, sometimes weighing goods to order. The relationship between the customer and the grocer was a personal one, built over years of regular trade. The grocer knew his regular customers, knew their preferences, knew their household circumstances. He might extend credit to a customer he trusted if her husband's army pay was late arriving. He might set aside a particular item for a regular customer when supply was limited. This personal relationship became more practically significant during the war, when the supply of certain goods became erratic, and the grocer's discretion in distributing limited supplies became more important. What was available and what was not available varied from week to week as the shipping losses and the production disruptions worked their way through the supply chain. Sugar was consistently difficult. The supplies from the beet fields of Europe, which had been a significant source before the war, were disrupted. Tea was subject to supply uncertainty. Fat, butter and margarine and lard for cooking was becoming more expensive and less reliably available. Dorothy noted what was available, adjusted her shopping to what could be obtained, and carried her purchases home in the string bag that was the standard shopping container. The queue. The queue had already become a feature of wartime shopping in 1916, though the formal rationing system that would make queuing universal was still in the future. When a particular desirable item arrived at a shop, fresh butter, for example, or a supply of sugar, word spread quickly through the neighbourhood and women formed a queue outside the shop. The queue was not new as a social phenomenon, but it acquired a specific wartime character during the war. The shared experience of waiting for goods that were insufficient for everyone who wanted them, the negotiations and accommodations that the limited supply required, the social texture of many women from the same neighbourhood standing together for an extended period. In the queue, the news of the neighbourhood was exchanged. Who had received a letter from the front, and what the letter had said, whose son or husband had been killed or wounded, the information arriving at the family's doors through the telegram from the War Office, and spreading through the neighbourhood with the speed of genuine community. Who was managing well, and who was struggling? The small commerce of neighbourhood knowledge. Dorothy was part of these queue conversations. She was part of the neighbourhood's information network, giving and receiving the news that the queue circulated. The death of someone's son from the next street was heard in the queue before the newspaper had reported it. Let us now think about the food in more detail. The wartime diet of the British civilian in 1916 was not yet the severely constrained diet of 1917 and 1918, when the submarine campaign had its worst effects and the rationing was formalised. In 1916, the diet was adequate if somewhat altered from the pre-war standard. The most significant change was in the meat supply. Meat was more expensive than before the war. The disruption of the Argentine and Australian cattle trade by the war's demands on shipping had reduced the imported supply, and the quality of the cheaper cuts was lower. Dorothy made more use of offal, the kidneys and liver and hearts and tails that were cheaper than the prime cuts. And she made more use of the vegetables that supplemented and stretched the meat. The vegetable garden in the backyard. Dorothy kept a vegetable garden in the small backyard behind the house. She had always grown a few things: runner beans against the back wall, lettuces in summer, a few tomatoes. But the wartime emphasis on food production had caused her to expand and intensify the garden. The Dig for Victory campaign would come in its complete form in the Second World War, but its predecessor existed in the First World War. The government urged civilian food production, kitchen gardens were expanded, allotments were taken on by people who had not previously grown vegetables. Dorothy's expanded garden produced potatoes, which were the most calorie-dense and space-efficient crop for a small garden, carrots and parsnips, which stored well, cabbages and kale, which provided green vegetable through the winter, onions, which were fundamental to the cooking, and whatever else the space and the season allowed. The garden was worked in the mornings and evenings, the soil turned and weeded and watered, the crops managed through their seasons. This work was not new to Dorothy. She had always had a garden, but the scale and the seriousness of it had increased. After the shopping, the cooking, the wartime cooking that Dorothy did each day was the cooking of a competent domestic manager working with what was available. The recipe books and women's magazines of the period were full of wartime cooking advice. How to use less fat, how to make meat go further, how to substitute one ingredient for another, how to make nourishing soups and stews from inexpensive ingredients. Soup was one of the more important preparations of the wartime kitchen, because it could be made from the bones and the vegetable trimmings that would otherwise have been waste, and because it was warm and filling and could be extended almost indefinitely. A pot of soup, on the range, simmering through the afternoon, produced a meal that was both nourishing and economical. The broth from a boiled piece of scrag end, the cheapest cut of mutton, the neck end, with whatever vegetables were available from the garden and the grocer, thickened with pearl barley or oatmeal, produced the kind of substantial soup that fed a family adequately. The scrag end itself, having contributed its flavour and its protein to the broth, was picked off the bone and added to the soup as the meat component. This was practical cooking, the cooking of women who understood the economics of the kitchen and the nutritional requirements of their households, who made the most of the available ingredients without reference to anything other than necessity and experience. The bread. Bread was still baked at home by many households, though the bakery bread was also available. Home baking in 1916 used the national flour, the flour that included more of the grain than the pre-war white flour, and produced a denser, darker loaf. The home baker's loaf was baked in the range oven, the dough made and left to rise and then shaped and baked in the specific rhythms of the experienced bread baker. Dorothy baked twice a week, the 2 baking days producing enough bread to last the household until the next baking. The smell of fresh bread in the house on baking days was the specific smell of those days, as characteristic as the smell of the garden on a summer morning or the smell of the coal fire in winter. Now let us think about the children. The children of the First World War in Britain grew up in the specific context of the war. They were aware of it, the absence of their father if their father was at the front, the changed social world of the neighbourhood where women managed without their husbands and where boys of 16 or 17 were enlisting as soon as they could present themselves credibly as 18. The specific wartime culture that surrounded them, the school. Dorothy's children's school continued through the war. Schools were not closed by the war. They continued their function of educating the children of the nation, though with reduced staffing as male teachers enlisted and had to be replaced by female teachers or by older men who had not been taken for service. The school curriculum in 1916 included not just the standard subjects, but an awareness of the war's context. Map reading had always been part of geography. The maps of France and Belgium and the various theatres of the war were familiar to schoolchildren in a new way. The newspapers were read in class. The war was the background of everything. The children raised money for various wartime causes, the Red Cross, the Belgian Relief Fund, the various appeals that organised the civilian contribution to the war effort. The school organised the collection of items that the troops needed, socks and scarves and comforts, or the raising of funds for these purposes. Children participated in this with the enthusiasm that children bring to collective projects with a clear purpose. Dorothy's son, the 12-year-old, had a specific relationship to the war that was shaped by his age and his gender. He was old enough to understand the war's meaning, young enough not to be in it, and aware that in a few years he would be the right age to be in it if it was still going on. This awareness, the specific awareness of the adolescent boy during the First World War that the war might still be there when he was old enough, was one of the more psychologically particular aspects of the civilian childhood experience. He did not speak of this. Boys of his age and class in 1916 did not speak of these things. The culture of the period did not encourage the expression of this kind of anxiety, particularly in males, but it was present in the specific way that things present themselves when they are real and are not spoken. Dorothy was aware of it. She did not speak of it either, in the specific way that she managed many of the war's anxieties, by managing the household, by writing the letters and reading the letters and making the soup. Let us now think about the letters. The letters between Dorothy and her husband were the primary mechanism by which they maintained their marriage across the distance of the Channel and the front. Dorothy's husband wrote when he could, which was not always. The forward areas of the front did not always allow the leisure of letter writing. The working parties and the watches and the general demands of the trench left limited time. But he wrote. The letters came in bunches, several arriving at once after, a gap, the accumulation of several days' writing, all appearing together because the postal system's operation was intermittent rather than daily. Dorothy kept the letters in a box. She had been keeping them since the beginning, and the box held by now nearly 2 years of correspondence. She read the letters more than once, as people read letters from those they love and miss. The first reading for the news, the subsequent readings for the specific quality of the person's presence that the letter conveyed. She wrote in return. Her letters described the household and the neighbourhood and the children, and the daily news of the life she was maintaining in his absence. She wrote about the garden, what was growing and what had failed. She wrote about the children's small achievements at school. She wrote about the neighbours and their news. She wrote about the small events of the town. She did not write about her anxieties, or she wrote about them in a managed form, acknowledging the difficulty without dwelling on it, maintaining the tone of someone who was managing well and expected to continue managing well. This was partly the epistolary convention of the period, which did not encourage extensive emotional expression, and partly the specific management of the emotional content of the letters. She knew he was reading them in conditions that already contained enough difficulty, and she did not want her letters to add to it. The specific censorship of the emotional content of wartime letters, the things not said, the anxieties held back, the tone maintained at a level that did not add to the burden of the reader, was one of the more particular qualities of the wartime correspondence. and underneath the managed tone, the real emotion, the love for the specific person and the missing of him, and the specific anxiety about his safety, and the specific isolation of managing the household and the children alone, and the specific wish that things were different. These things were present in the letters, not always expressed directly, but present. The letter was sealed and addressed and placed on the hall table to be posted. The next letter would arrive in a few days, or a week, or when the postal service brought it. Let us now think about the women's contribution to the war effort. Dorothy was not working in a factory. She was managing the household, which was itself a contribution. The maintained household, the fed and educated children, the continued domestic life. But she was also involved in the various voluntary activities that the wartime civilian life organized. The local hospital, the voluntary aid detachments, the VADs, the women's voluntary nursing organizations that supplemented the professional nursing staff of the hospitals, provided an enormous amount of care throughout the war. Women who were not professional nurses but who received basic training provided nursing auxiliary services, the dressing of wounds, the care of the injured, the management of the hospital wards. Dorothy was not a VAD. She was too busy with the household and the children to take on that level of commitment. But she was involved in the voluntary activities that required less of a time commitment. The making of bandages and dressings, the knitting of socks and scarves, the organization of parcels for the troops, the knitting. The knitting of comforts for the troops was one of the most characteristic voluntary activities of the First World War home front. Women knitted socks, scarves, balaclavas, mittens, all the woolen items that the soldiers in the trenches needed and that the army's supply could not always adequately provide. The patterns for military knitting were circulated by the Red Cross and other organizations, and the women who knitted worked from these patterns to produce items of the specific specifications required. The socks, for example, had specific requirements: the right thickness of yarn, the right gauge, the appropriate length. Items that were too loosely knit or too short would not do the job. Dorothy knitted in the evenings. She had always knitted. It was a skill that was near universal among women of her generation and class, and the wartime knitting gave the evening habit a purposeful focus. She knitted socks primarily, the repetitive pattern of the sock being the kind of work that could be done by the hands, while the attention was elsewhere, while listening to the children or to the sounds of the street outside. The finished socks and scarves accumulated until there were enough to make a parcel, and the parcel was sent through the Red Cross or through the various organizations that collected and distributed them. This parcel, arriving at the front, was received by some soldier who was not Dorothy's husband, but who was someone's husband or son or brother. The personal nature of the knitting, the specific pair of hands that had made this specific pair of socks, was not lost on those who received them. Now let us think about the specific anxieties of the wartime civilian, the telegram. The telegram from the War Office was the mechanism by which the army informed families of the death or serious wounding of a serviceman. The telegram was delivered by a boy on a bicycle, and the sight of the boy on the bicycle approaching a house was understood by everyone in the neighborhood. The telegram boy on a bicycle was a specific visual symbol of the worst possible news and his presence in a street produced the specific anxiety of watching him approach, the relief when he stopped at someone else's gate, the guilt of the relief, and the sympathy for the household where he did stop. Dorothy had seen the telegram boy on her street twice since the war began. On both occasions he had stopped at another house. The relief and the guilt were specific each time. She had not told her husband about either instance, though he probably knew from his own sources. Soldiers heard about the deaths of neighbours through the Trenches Information Network, which was its own form of community. The management of this anxiety, the background awareness that the telegram boy might at any time turn into her gate, was one of the defining features of the wartime civilian experience for the woman whose husband was at the front. It was managed, as sustained anxiety tends to be managed when it cannot be resolved, by the continuation of normal life, by the occupation of the hands and the mind with the daily tasks, by the deliberate not dwelling. You did not sit in the parlour thinking about the telegram. You went to the shops and you made the soup and you supervised the children's homework and you knitted the socks. The activity was not distraction in a frivolous sense. It was the productive maintenance of the life that was, in its maintenance, an act of faith that there would be a life after the war into which the absent person would return. The newspapers of the First World War are one of the more discussed aspects of the civilian experience, because the newspapers were the primary source of information about the war's progress, and because the information they provided was shaped by the military censorship that governed what could be published. The censorship. The newspapers could not publish information that would be useful to the enemy. The locations of units, the casualties of specific actions before official announcement, the details of military plans. This was reasonable as a military security measure, but the censorship also had the effect of presenting the war in a way that was more favourable to the Allied cause than the facts sometimes warranted. The newspapers of the first year of the war had presented the conflict with a patriotic enthusiasm that was partly genuine and partly the result of censored information. As the war continued and the casualties accumulated, and as the returning soldiers' experiences filtered back into the civilian world through the men home on leave and through the conversations of communities that were losing their sons, the gap between the newspaper's presentation of the war and the reality that people were beginning to understand became more visible. Dorothy read the newspapers, as most literate adults did. She read them with a specific kind of attention that had developed over the course of the war, not the innocent acceptance of the first months, but the more practiced reading of someone who had learned to read between the lines, to note what was not said as well as what was said, to calibrate the information provided against what she heard from other sources, the soldiers on leave, the men who came back from the front on their brief periods of leave brought the war with them in ways that were often more informative than the newspapers. Not through explicit military information, soldiers on leave were aware of the consequences of saying too much, but through the specific quality of their silence about some things, and the things they chose to say. Dorothy's neighbour's husband had come home on leave in the spring. He had sat in the front parlour and drunk tea and talked about various things, and he had not talked about the front directly, and the various things he had talked about had communicated to Dorothy and to her neighbour more than the words said. He looked different. Not older exactly. He was not much more than a year from when he had enlisted, but different. The specific difference that the front produced in these who had been there, which was visible in the face and in the manner without being easily described. He went back to France 2 weeks after arriving. Her neighbour wept when he left. Dorothy did not see this, but she heard about it. The neighbourhood's information network carrying the news as it carried everything. Let us now think about the town's economy. The wartime economy of a provincial English town in 1916 was undergoing the specific changes that the war had produced. Many of the town's industries had converted to war production. The engineering firms that had produced agricultural machinery were producing shells. The textile mills that had made cloth for civilian use were producing khaki and blankets, and the various fabrics required for military equipment. This conversion had produced full employment. More than full employment, in fact, as the labour pool had been reduced by the enlistment of working men, and the demand for industrial production had increased. The factory work available was more than the available workforce could fill, and this labour shortage was addressed by bringing in workers who had not previously been in industrial employment, women who had been in domestic service, or who had been managing households, men too old for military service, workers brought in from other areas, the wages being paid in the munitions factories and the other war production industries were higher than pre-war wages. The women who had entered the factories were earning more than they had earned before the war, or were earning wages where previously they had earned none. The domestic servant who now worked in a factory, moving from a position of board and lodging and small wages to an independent wage that gave her more economic freedom. Dorothy did not work in a factory. Her situation, managing the household with 2 children, her husband's absence making her the sole adult manager, did not allow the commitment of regular factory work. But she was aware of the changed economic situation around her, visible in the higher wages, the different spending patterns, the specific conversations about money that the wartime economy produced, the separation allowance. When a married man enlisted, his wife was entitled to a separation allowance from the government, in addition to the deduction from his army pay that he could allot to her. The separation allowance was the government's recognition that the enlisted man's wife needed financial support in his absence. The allowance was modest. It was sufficient for basic maintenance but did not represent prosperity. Dorothy managed on the separation allowance and the allotment from her husband's pay with the careful management of the experienced household economist, tracking the household's expenses against its income, making the adjustments that kept the two in balance. The price rises that the war produced were a consistent challenge. The inflation of the wartime period, driven by the increased demand and the supply disruptions, made the money that had been adequate before the war less adequate as the war continued. The careful household manager in 1916 was managing a budget that required more constant attention than the pre-war budget had. Let us now think about the evenings. The evenings in Dorothy's house in 1916 were the evenings of a household that had been reorganized around one adult rather than 2. After the children's supper, the homework supervision, the washing and the preparation for bed, after all of this was managed, Dorothy had the evening more or less to herself. This was different from the pre-war evening, which had been the shared evening of husband and wife, the specific companionship of a marriage settled into its daily rhythms. The wartime evening was not shared, and the absence of the person with whom it would have been shared was most felt in this specific time. She managed it. She read. She knitted. She wrote the letters that would go to France. She sat by the range fire in the kitchen. The parlour was not heated in the evenings, the coal being too precious to waste on an unoccupied room, and she thought whatever she thought. The radio did not exist in this form yet. The BBC, that would be the constant background companion of the Second World War civilian, was not yet broadcasting. What existed were the newspapers, the books, the occasional concert or lecture or theatre that the town's cultural life provided, and the conversations with the neighbours that were the oral medium of community information and entertainment. The music in the home. Dorothy played the piano, not well but adequately, the level of piano skill that was considered standard in educated households of the period. In the evenings, when the children were in bed and the evening's tasks were done, she sometimes played. The songs she played were the songs of the period, which included both the popular songs of the wartime culture, It's a Long Way to Tipperary, Keep the Home Fires Burning, the various songs that were sung in the music halls and that spread through the culture as the war's soundtrack, and the parlour songs and classical pieces that her pre-war repertoire included, playing the piano alone, in the kitchen, by the fire's light and the oil lamp's light. This was its own specific experience, the music filling the small space of the evening, the familiar pieces playing through the fingers. Let us now think about the church. The Church of England in the First World War was a significant presence in the civilian life of a provincial town. Dorothy attended church on Sundays as she had always attended, as her neighbours attended, as the town's social and cultural life organised itself around. The church in wartime was a specific institution. It held the names of the parish's men who were serving, the roll of honour that accumulated names as the war continued, and that was read during the services. It held the memorial services for those who had died, the specific services for specific men from the parish, attended by the families and the neighbours. The vicar, in his sermons, addressed the war from the pulpit with the theology of the Church of England as interpreted by his specific understanding and personality. The range of theological responses to the war among the clergy was considerable. Some preached a straightforwardly patriotic theology in which the war was a just and necessary conflict, and the soldiers who died were sacrificed for a righteous cause. Others preached with more ambiguity, acknowledging the sacrifice without the rhetoric of the noble death. A very few were already, even in the middle years of the war, questioning the theology that made the war's cost comprehensible. Dorothy sat in the pew she had always sat in, and listened to what was said and thought what she thought, and the church was the church it had always been, in a world that was not what it had always been. The church also organised practical activities. The Women's Guild and the Sewing Circle and the various charitable activities were organised around the parish structure. The collecting of items for the troops, the organisation of care for the families in difficulty, the various expressions of community solidarity that the church organised were part of the community's response to the war. Now let us think about the food situation in more detail. The bread queue of 1917 had not yet arrived in 1916, but the signs of the coming difficulty were present in the rising prices and the occasional scarcity that Dorothy was already navigating. The government's response to the food situation in the middle years of the war evolved through the period. from appeals to voluntary economy to the establishment of the Food Controller's Office to the eventual introduction of formal rationing in 1918. In the meantime, Dorothy managed with the voluntary economy that the situation required and the practical intelligence that she brought to the management of the household. Potatoes. The potato was one of the more reliable components of the wartime diet, being grown domestically in sufficient quantities to maintain supply, even as other foods became scarcer. Dorothy's garden potatoes supplemented the household's diet throughout the growing season and, stored in the cellar, extended into the winter. The specific pleasure of the first new potatoes of the season, small, waxy, perfectly boiled with mint from the garden and served with butter, was one of the genuine gastronomic pleasures of the wartime year. Not because new potatoes were unusual, they appeared every year, but because the wartime context gave the familiar its specific value. The good thing that was there to be enjoyed, the pleasure that was available, the garden's other produce, the runner beans, which gave generously through the summer, the autumn cabbages, the parsnips and carrots that were harvested and stored. All of it was managed carefully, eaten fresh, when fresh, stored or preserved when storing or preserving was appropriate, the jam making, summer fruit, the gooseberries from the bush and back garden, the raspberries that the neighbour shared from her more productive plot, the plums from the tree at the bottom of the garden was made into jam. The jam-making day in summer was a domestic industry, the fruit cleaned and prepared, the sugar dissolved with it, the jam brought to setting point and poured into the jars sealed and labelled and stored in the pantry. The sugar for jam making was an issue in a period when sugar was becoming scarce. Dorothy managed by using the minimum sugar needed for setting and by making somewhat less jam than in peacetime. The jam that resulted was good, if not as sweet as pre-war jam, and the pantry shelf with its row of jars was its own small form of security. Provisions made, winter anticipated, the household prepared. The pantry. The pantry in Dorothy's house was a small, cool room off the kitchen, its shelves holding the household's stored provisions. The jars of jam, the tin of flour, the oatmeal, the dried beans, the various bottled and canned items that were the household's reserves. Looking at the pantry shelf was a way of assessing the household's state, whether there was sufficient for the coming weeks, whether anything needed to be replenished, whether the management of the household's resources had been adequate. This assessment, the practical inventory of the household, was one of the continuous background activities of the household manager, done automatically, without formal process, the information maintained in the running awareness that managed the household's functioning. Let us now think about the news. The news in 1916. 1916 was one of the most catastrophic years of the war. The Battle of the Somme, which began on the 1st of July and continued through November, produced casualties on a scale that was genuinely shocking, even by the standards of a war that had already produced enormous casualties. On the first day of the Somme, the British Army suffered nearly 60,000 casualties, including nearly 20,000 dead. This information did not reach the civilian population in its full form immediately. The censorship of military information meant that the scale of the casualty figures was not published in the newspapers in real time. The official communiqué spoke of gains and of the offensive proceeding according to plan. But the casualties were real, and they arrived in the civilian world through the telegram boy, and through the growing lists of the dead in the newspapers, and through the conversations in the queue, and in the church, and in the street. By the autumn of 1916, the civilian understanding of the Somme was not the newspaper's version, but the community's version. The accumulation of specific knowledge about specific deaths, names and faces that were known, the aggregate of particular losses forming the population's understanding of what the offensive had cost. Dorothy knew 3 men from the town who had died on the Somme or in the fighting around it. One she had known well, the husband of a close friend, a man she had known since childhood, one she had known slightly, a neighbour's son, 20 years old, whom she had seen in the street every day for as long as she could remember, one she had not known personally, but whose family was part of the parish, whose name appeared on the roll of honour at church. 3 specific deaths connected to her specific life, and her husband was still at the front, still writing the letters that arrived in bunches, still alive as of the latest letter, whose date was now 10 days in the past. 10 days in the past in which anything could have happened. This was the wartime civilian's permanent condition, the knowledge that the information you had was out of date, that the present moment of the person you loved was inaccessible to you, and that the gap between the letter and now was a space in which the worst could have happened without your knowing. She managed this in the way she managed everything, by continuing, by making the soup and writing the letter and knitting the socks and getting the children to school, by keeping the home fires burning in the most literal and the most figurative sense. Let us now think about the evening as it wound toward its end. After the children were in bed and the evening's tasks were done, Dorothy sat by the range with her knitting or her book, the fire still warm though beginning to die down, the evening quiet around her, the sounds of the evening house, the settling of the building's timbers as the day's warmth dissipated, the small sounds of the children asleep upstairs, the distant sounds of the street. The street outside in 1916 was quieter at night than a modern street, though there was no blackout. Gas lamps lit by the lamplighter provided pools of light at intervals along the pavement. The occasional pedestrian passed. The horse-drawn traffic that still predominated over motor vehicles produced its specific sounds. The hooves on the stone sets, the rattle of the cart, the harness, the town's specific nighttime sounds, the distant sound of a dog, the sound of the railway in the distance if the wind was right, the sound of the neighbour's voice or door. These sounds were the sounds of her life, as familiar as the sounds of the house itself. She lived in them without particular awareness, as people live in the sounds of their familiar environment. The knitting in the evenings, the sock on the needles, the specific rhythm of the knitting needles, the click of the metal needles against each other, the specific feel of the wool being drawn through the fingers. A row completed, then another, the sock growing slowly toward the toe, and somewhere in France, the soldier for whom it was being made. Not her husband. She was sending these to the Red Cross distribution rather than to him directly. Some soldier, somewhere in the front line, who would receive a pair of socks made by her hands. The connection that the knitting created, the physical object moving from her hands to the hands of an unknown soldier, was one of the specific qualities of the wartime voluntary contribution. It was not abstract. It was a specific object, made by specific hands, received by specific hands. The intimacy of the handmade gift extended to strangers, the fire dying down, the coal spent for the evening, the range having given its warmth through the cooking and the evening, the fire now the glow of coals rather than the flame, the book set aside, the knitting set aside for the night, the lamp extinguished, the kitchen quiet and dark, the stairs, the bedroom, the bed, her husband's side of the bed, which she still called his side, which was still his side even in his absence, which she did not sleep on. The specific quiet of the bedroom, the specific smell of the bedroom, the old wood of the furniture, the specific quality of the sheets, the lavender that she had put in the drawer last summer, the lying down, the day released, the morning shopping, the soup, the children's school, the knitting, the evening, the fire, all of it behind her now, all of it receding into the past that would accumulate until he came home and the life resumed its normal shape. And the night ahead, long and dark and quiet, and the thought of him, somewhere in France, in whatever condition the latest letter had not described, and then sleep, the sleep that came because the body required it, and because the body's requirements did not wait on the resolution of the anxieties that the mind maintained. Sleep, as simple and as necessary as that, as it is for you, right now, in your dark, in your quiet, after your day, the keeping of the home fires burning, the waiting, the management of what could be managed, and now this, the rest, the full, genuine, available rest, which belongs to you as it belonged to her, which is here, now. Good night, for those still awake. The night is long and the wartime home front has more to tell. Let us continue. Let us think about the children's experience of the war in more detail. The school in wartime was a specific environment, shaped by the war's demands and by the changed social context of the town. The male teachers who had enlisted were replaced, as noted, by female teachers and older men. This substitution was sometimes seamless. A good teacher was a good teacher regardless of age or gender, and sometimes less so, the replacement being less experienced or less suited to the role. The children noticed and adapted, as children adapt to the specific adults who are put in charge of them. The curriculum was not fundamentally changed, but the war was present in it. Geography was studied with new attention to the theatres of the war. History was read with the awareness that history was being made outside the classroom window. Current events, never a formal part of the curriculum but always present in the discussions that any engaged teacher would provoke, were shaped entirely by the war, the school, collected for the various wartime causes. The pennies that children brought from home, accumulated into shillings and pounds, were donated to the Belgian Relief Fund or the Red Cross or whatever the current appeal was. The children understood that their pennies were connected to the war, that the war was real and present and required something of them. The older boys, the 14-year-olds who were leaving school that year, were entering a world in which the choice they would face in a few years was imminent and known. The leaving age for school in the period was typically 14, and the boy who left school at 14 in 1916 would be 18 in 1920. If the war was still going in 1920, which by the middle of 1916 seemed entirely possible, he would be old enough to enlist or to be conscripted. Conscription. the Military Service Act of January 1916 had introduced compulsory military service for single men between 18 and 41. In May 1916, this was extended to married men. The introduction of conscription was a significant change from the voluntary system of 1914 and 1915, and it meant that the question of who served and who did not serve was now determined by law rather than individual choice. The tribunal system that administered conscription included provisions for conscientious objectors, those who objected to military service on grounds of conscience, whether religious or ethical. The tribunals that heard the applications for conscientious objector status were made up of local civilians, and their decisions were inconsistent and sometimes arbitrary. The experience of the conscientious objector in the First World War, the social stigma, the legal process, the various forms of alternative service that were sometimes offered and sometimes not, was one of the more contested aspects of the civilian war. Dorothy had opinions about conscription and about the conscientious objectors that she kept largely to herself, as she kept many opinions to herself. The social pressure to express the correct attitudes, patriotic, supportive of the war, contemptuous of those who avoided service, was real, and the social consequences of expressing contrary views were real. The white feathers, the campaign by certain women to present white feathers, the traditional symbol of cowardice, to men of military age who were not in uniform, was one of the more unpleasant civilian phenomena of the First World War. Women, acting on the assumption that any man not in uniform was a coward or a shirker, presented the feathers without any information about the man's specific situation. Whether he was in a reserved occupation essential to the war effort, whether he had been medically rejected, whether he was on home leave from the front, Dorothy had not participated in this campaign. She found it distressing, partly for its inaccuracy. She could see the situations where the assumption was wrong, and partly for its aggressive assertion of a particular version of patriotic obligation. But she did not say this publicly. You did not say many things publicly during the war that you thought privately. The social pressure toward conformity was real, and the consequences of non-conformity were real. This management of the private and the public, the thoughts maintained internally that were not expressed, was another of the specific features of the wartime civilian experience. Let us now think about the specific economics of the wartime household in more detail. The cost of living. The inflation of the First World War years was substantial. The price of food rose significantly between 1914 and 1918, driven by the supply disruptions of the submarine campaign and by the general inflationary pressure of a wartime economy. Bread became more expensive, meat became more expensive, coal became more expensive. The separation allowance and the allotment from her husband's army pay did not rise at the same rate as the cost of living. The household that had been adequately provided for in 1914 was more constrained in 1916, and would be more constrained still in 1917 and 1918. Dorothy managed this by the ordinary techniques of household economy, buying the cheaper cuts of meat, extending the meat with vegetable matter, reducing consumption where it could be reduced, maintaining the garden as a supplement to the purchased food supply. She did not regard this as hardship in any dramatic sense. It was management, the kind of management that the household always required, and that required more attention in difficult conditions than in easy ones. The women who were managing without the income that the husband's civilian employment would have provided, on the fixed income of the separation allowance in the context of rising prices, these women were doing work that was essential to the maintenance of the civilian life of the nation, and that was not recognized as such. The labour force. The women who had entered the factories and the offices and the transport systems as workers were doing essential work, visible and economized by the wartime consciousness that noted the change and valued the contribution. The women who were managing households and raising children and keeping the domestic economy running were doing essential work that was less visible, less noted, less consciously valued, but equally necessary. Dorothy was in the second category, and she knew it, and she continued. Let us now think about the specific management of the household's time. The wartime day was long, as peacetime days had been long. The domestic work of a household was always more than an 8-hour day's worth of tasks. The cooking, the cleaning, the management of the children, the shopping, the garden, the voluntary activities, the letter writing, the knitting, all of this together filled more hours than the day formerly contained. It was managed by priority and by the acceptance that not everything would be done perfectly. The house was kept adequately clean but not perfectly clean. The meals were nutritious but not elaborate. The children were supervised but not hovered over. The garden was maintained but not manicured. This practical acceptance of the adequate over the perfect was one of the necessary adjustments of the wartime household. The pre-war standard, the standard of the household with 2 adults and adequate resources, was not achievable by a single adult managing on constrained resources. The standard was adjusted to what was achievable, and the achievable was what was done. This adjustment was made without great drama, because drama was not useful. You simply managed at the level that the conditions permitted, and the conditions permitted a good deal if you were practical and organized and not given to complaint. The specific freedom of the wartime. This is perhaps the most counterintuitive aspect of the First World War. Civilian experience for women. The specific freedoms that the war created. With the men away, the management of affairs that had been the man's domain by convention fell to the women by necessity. The financial management of the household, the management of the small property decisions, the management of the children's education and welfare, the dealings with tradesmen and institutions, women who had previously deferred to their husbands on these matters found themselves managing them independently and found that they were competent to manage them, often more competent than the social convention that had assigned these roles to men had suggested. Dorothy managed the household finances with a competence that her husband had trusted from the beginning, which was why he had not hesitated in assigning the management to her when he enlisted. But she also managed things that in peacetime she had not needed to manage. The correspondence with the landlord about a repair, the negotiation with the Coleman over a delivery, the decision about the children's shoes that she would have discussed with her husband before making. These independent decisions accumulated into the experience of being a person who made decisions, who managed affairs, who was competent in the world beyond the domestic sphere. The specific growth of confidence that came from successfully managing things that you had not previously managed was real, and it was the wartime civilian woman's specific gain from a situation that was in other ways a loss. This gain would not be immediately translated into changed social circumstances after the war. The returning soldiers would return to the management roles they had vacated, the women would step back, and the specific freedoms of the wartime would be partly reversed. The political change, the 1918 extension of the vote to women over 30 who met a property qualification, the 1928 equal franchise, was partly driven by the recognition of women's wartime contribution, but partly it was a longer social change that the war had accelerated. In 1916, Dorothy was not thinking about the vote, or about the social changes that the war might produce. She was thinking about whether the coal house needed to be filled before the cold weather set in, and whether the boys' school uniform trousers would last another term, and when the next letter would arrive. The ordinary, which is what this story has been about. The ordinary life of the wartime civilian, the soup and the coal and the garden and the knitting and the letters and the queue and the children and the church and the evening by the fire and the sleep, which is here, right now. The fire died down, the knitting set aside, the letter sealed, the children asleep upstairs, the bedroom quiet, the specific smell of the familiar room, and sleep, available, necessary, real, here, take it, as she took it, night after night through the years of the war. And the morning came, and the day was managed, and the evening came again, and the sleep, as it comes now. Good night. The other countries, the wartime civilian experience was not only British. Let us spend a little time with other countries. France, the French civilian experience of the First World War was in some respects more direct than the British, because significant portions of northern France were occupied by the German army for the duration of the war. The Marne, the Somme, the Aisne, the Chemin des Dames. The battles of the Western Front were fought on French soil, and the French population of those regions experienced the war in the most immediate possible way. The occupation, the destruction, the displacement. The French woman who was not in the occupied zones experienced the war more as the British woman did. The absent husband or son, the rationing of certain goods, the management of the household in his absence, the letters and the anxiety. But France also had the additional burden of being the country whose soil was being destroyed. The chateau and the farmhouses and the village churches and the fields that had been productive for centuries were in the zone of operations, and the destruction that the fighting caused was permanent in many cases. The French household in Paris or Lyon or Bordeaux managed a wartime life that was similar in its daily texture to the British experience, with the added weight of knowing that the war was being fought on French ground, destroying French heritage, killing French men in French fields. Germany. The German civilian experience of the First World War was shaped significantly by the British naval blockade that cut Germany off from overseas food supplies. The blockade, unlike the German submarine campaign against British shipping, was not subject to the political limitations that the German submarines faced. Britain blockaded German ports and shipping routes systematically and effectively, and the result was a progressive deterioration in the German civilian food supply that became severe by 1916 and desperate by 1917 and 1918. The turnip winter of 1916-17, named for the turnip that became the primary food of the German civilian population as other foodstuffs were exhausted, was one of the more extreme experiences of civilian wartime deprivation in the First World War. The German civilian diet in the worst months consisted primarily of turnips and bread, made from mixtures that included turnip flour, as the wheat and other grain supplies were directed preferentially to the military. The German woman managing a household in Berlin in the winter of 1916 to 17 was managing a food situation considerably more severe than Dorothy's. The queue she stood in was for food that was genuinely scarce, not merely more expensive or less varied than before. The specific calculations of survival, how to obtain enough calories for the household, how to supplement the official ration with whatever could be found, were more urgent. The specific quality of the German civilians' experience, the combination of the patriotic investment in the German cause and the specific, grinding daily privation of the blockade, was one of the more distinctive civilian experiences of the war. The Russian civilian. The Russian Empire's civilian population in Moscow and in St. Petersburg, in the vast agricultural provinces, in the various nationalities and classes and religious communities that the empire encompassed, had a wartime experience that was in many ways the most extreme and most varied of any of the major powers. The disruption of the Russian economy by the war's demands, the inefficiency of the Russian logistics system, the political instability that culminated in the 1917 revolutions, all of these produced a civilian situation that was more chaotic and more violent than the Western European experience. The Russian woman in St. Petersburg in the winter of 1916 to 17, standing in the bread queue that did not have enough bread, was closer to the edge of the revolution that would reshape her world than any Western European civilian was to any comparable rupture. But in the daily texture of managing a household on insufficient resources, in the letter to and from the husband at the front, in the management of the children's welfare in difficult conditions, the Russian civilian woman was doing something recognizable as the same thing that Dorothy was doing, the same daily management, the same anxieties, the same sleep at the end of the day, all of them, in their specific countries and their specific conditions, in the same sleep as you are in your sleep now, or becoming so. Good night. The sound of the town, the sound of Dorothy's town in 1916 was the sound of a town that had been significantly altered by the war without being destroyed. The men who were absent, their voices no longer in the streets, their footsteps no longer on the pavement, their presence no longer in the pubs and the shops and the church, the women who were more present than before, in the shops and the offices and the factories, in the public spaces that had been more heavily male before the war. The children who continued to be in the streets and the parks and the school playgrounds, the young ones oblivious to much of the war's significance, the older ones aware in the specific ways that adolescence and the ambient culture produced. The specific sounds that the war had added, the departure of the troop trains from the station, audible from certain streets on certain days, the sound of the military band that sometimes played in the park when a recruitment or a patriotic occasion was organised, the sound of the church bell when it was rung for a memorial service, and the sounds that were absent because the men were absent, the specific sounds of masculinity in the working town, the sounds of the pub, the sounds of certain kinds of physical labour. The town was altered in sound as it was altered in every other way, recognisably itself significantly changed. Dorothy moved through this sound world every day, hearing what she heard without particularly analysing it. the street she walked to the shops, the sounds of the shops, the sounds of the queue, the sounds of the school at the end of the day when she collected the children, all of it the sound of her world, altered and continued. And in the evenings, the sound of the house, and in the bedroom, the quiet, and the sleep that came into the quiet, as it comes now into your quiet. Good night. The long patience. The First World War produced a specific virtue in the civilian population of the countries most affected by it. Patience. Not the easy patience of someone waiting for a pleasant thing, the hard patience of someone waiting for an end that could not be predicted, managing a present that was difficult, maintaining the domestic and social fabric that the war was straining. This patience was not passive, it was active, expressed in the daily management of the household, and the voluntary activities, and the letters, and the knitting, and all the rest. It was the patience of continuation, the understanding that the thing to do was to continue, and so you continued. The war did end in 1918. The armistice came on November 11th, 1918, and the guns that had been audible in southern England on quiet nights throughout the war fell silent. The men came home, not all of them. The million British dead did not come home, and the millions of dead from the other nations did not come home. But the survivors came home, and among them, let us say, Dorothy's husband. He came back to the house on the street that was as he had left it and not as he had left it. The house was the same. Dorothy was the same person and not the same person. She was the person who had managed alone for 4 years, who had made the decisions and managed the finances and raised the children and kept the garden and written the letters. The children were 4 years older. He was the person who had been in France for 4 years and who brought France back with him in the specific ways that 4 years of that experience produces. The adjustment of the return, the specific difficulty of two people resuming a life together after a long separation that had changed both of them. This was the end of the wartime civilian experience. Not a clean resolution, but a complex continuation. The adjustment of the returned civilian life to the people they had become. And in the meantime, the sleep. The sleep that Dorothy had taken every night through the 4 years of the war. The same sleep that is here for you now. The sleep of the patient management of a difficult time. The sleep that comes at the end of the day that was managed. Real. Available, yours, now, in the dark, in the quiet. After the war, that is not your war, but the night. That is your night. Sleep. Good night. The allotment, in detail. The allotment that Dorothy tended. The small communal plot she had taken on early in the war when the government began encouraging civilian food production, was located a short walk from the house, on ground that the local council had made available for this purpose. The allotment community was a specific community. The plots were arranged in rows, each one a standard size, each one tended by its holder with varying degrees of energy and skill. The range of expertise was considerable. The experienced gardener who had grown vegetables all his life and whose plot was a model of orderly productivity. The newcomer who had never grown anything and who approached the allotment with enthusiasm that somewhat compensated for the lack of knowledge, and every point between. Dorothy's plot was somewhere in the middle of this range. She had grown vegetables at home before the war, though not at the scale that the allotment allowed. She had learned additional skills during the war, from the advice columns in the women's magazines, from the government's gardening leaflets, from the more experienced allotment holders nearby who were willing to share what they knew. The advice flowed across the allotment fence with the same generality that it flowed over the back garden wall or in the queue at the grocer's. What to plant when, how to deal with the aphids that were attacking the broad beans, the best way to store carrots through the winter, the specific variety of potato that had done well in the specific soil of these plots. The allotment was one of the places where the wartime community expressed itself, the shared project of food production, the shared knowledge of what worked and what did not, the shared identity of people who were doing something real and productive in a period that made real and productive activity feel necessary. On the allotment on a Saturday morning with the autumn, work of harvesting and preparing the beds for winter in progress, the sound of tools on soil and the sounds of the conversation across the fence constituted a small world of practical activity and social connection. Dorothy worked her allotment on Saturday mornings when the weather permitted, and on the occasional weekday morning when the other demands of the household allowed. She came with her tools, the spade, the fork, the trowel, and she worked through whatever the season's tasks were. Digging was the most fundamental allotment task, the digging over of the beds, turning the soil, incorporating whatever compost or manure was available, breaking up the clods, preparing the surface for planting or for the winter's rest, was physical work that used the body fully. Dorothy was not physically weak. 4 years of managing a household without help had maintained a level of practical physical fitness that the peacetime household had also provided. She dug steadily and, without too much strain, the specific rhythm of digging, the drive of the spade into the earth, the turn, the breaking of the clod, becoming automatic after enough repetition. The physical satisfaction of digging well-prepared ground, of seeing the turned earth ready for the next season, was one of the more concrete satisfactions of the wartime. The ground was ready. Something would grow, the household would eat. This directness, the visible connection between the work and the food, was one of the allotment's specific rewards. After the allotment, the walk home, the town around her, the same streets, the altered population, the women more numerous and more visible in the public spaces, the older men who had not enlisted, the occasional soldier on leave, or the occasional disabled man who had returned from the front. The town was familiar and unfamiliar simultaneously, as it had been for 4 years. The streets were the same streets. The buildings were the same buildings. But the population that moved through them was different. The atmosphere was different. The sense of the town's life was different. She walked home. She made the midday meal. The afternoon continued. Let us now think about the specific texture of a Sunday. Sunday in wartime Britain was Sunday in the way it had always been Sunday, organised around the church service and the specific rhythm of the day of rest, the church service. Dorothy and the children walked to church in the morning. The service was the Church of England morning service, the liturgy of the Book of Common Prayer, the hymns, the sermon, the specific communal experience of the congregation gathered. The congregation was changed. The pews that had held young and middle-aged men were occupied by women and older men. The roll of honour on the wall had grown longer. The prayers for those serving in the forces were a regular part of the service, but the service itself was the same service that had been held in that church for generations. The same words, the same rhythms, the same hymns. The specific comfort of the unchanging liturgy in the changing world was one of the things the church provided, and it was valued. After church, the Sunday dinner. Sunday dinner was the main meal of the week, the meal at which the household's best resources were deployed. In 1916, the Sunday dinner was somewhat reduced from its pre-war ambitions. The joint of meat that had been the centerpiece was smaller. The various accompaniments adjusted to what was available, but it was still Sunday dinner, still the meal that organized the week's catering and around which the family gathered. Dorothy made the Sunday dinner with attention. The vegetable soup first, using the chicken or the bone broth that had been set going on Saturday. The main course, a piece of mutton perhaps, or a rabbit that the neighbour's husband had found and shared, or a piece of salt beef that had been soaked and prepared. The potatoes from the garden, roasted or boiled or mashed according to what went best with the main. The gravy, the cabbage or the kale, whatever the garden had provided. Pudding. The pudding was the specific Sunday pleasure, the suet pudding or the rice pudding or the baked apple from the tree at the end of the garden. Something sweet, something hot, something that was the specific mark of the Sunday meal. The children ate with pleasure. The Sunday dinner was one of the week's pleasures, and it was eaten with the appetite of children who had not been overfed, and who appreciated a meal that was better than the ordinary weekday meals. After dinner, the afternoon. Sunday afternoon was the rest period of the week. Dorothy rested. The children played. The house was quiet in a way that weekdays were not. If the weather was good, a walk, the Sunday afternoon walk in the park or the fields at the edge of the town, was a standard activity for families of this period, the managed leisure of the Sunday being one of the week's reliable pleasures. If the weather was poor, the afternoon was spent indoors, reading, the children's games, Dorothy's knitting or her mending, the specific Sunday quietness. In the afternoon, she might write the weekly letter to her husband. Sunday was the day when there was most time for the letter, the most time for the attention that the letter required, the least interrupted time. She sat at the table with the paper and the pen and she wrote. She described the morning church service, the dinner, the children's Sunday afternoon. She described the state of the allotment. She described the small news of the neighbourhood that had accumulated through the week. She described, with the care she always took in calibrating the emotional content of the letters, something of how she was, the specific discipline of the letter, the selection of what to say and what not to say, the tone maintained at the level that was appropriate, the affection expressed in the register that was natural to them, the anxieties managed to the degree that they could be managed, the letter sealed and addressed and ready for the Monday morning post, the Sunday evening, the quietest period of the week. The children were bathed and in bed early, the Sunday routine allowing the earlier bedtime that the school night bedtime did not always achieve. Dorothy had the evening to herself in the specific Sunday way. She read, perhaps, or she knitted. The fire was a little better on Sundays, the coal used with slightly less economy than on weekdays. The evening was the specific Sunday evening, the end of the week's one day of rest, the preparation for the week that would follow, and then bed and the sleep that came, which was the Sunday sleep which had its own quality, the accumulated rest of the day, the specific quietness of the Sunday. the body having had the chance to be somewhat less driven through the day. The Sunday sleep was the week's best. Sleep, perhaps, as your sleep tonight can be the sleep of a day that was managed, and of an evening that was restful, and of a night that is quiet. The same quality. Available. Now. Good night. The letter in detail. Let us spend more time with the letter, because the letter was so central to the wartime civilian experience. The letter that Dorothy wrote each week to her husband in France was not a literary document. It was not written with the awareness of posterity, not composed with care for its artistic qualities. It was written with the practical purpose of communication, to tell him that she was well, that the children were well, that the household was functioning, that she was thinking of him. But within this practical purpose there was also the purpose of connection, the maintenance of the relationship across the distance and the time, the assertion of the continuity of the marriage and the family and the life that they would return to. The specific things she wrote about the children's school reports, which had arrived that week and which showed that both children were progressing adequately. She wrote about the boys' cricket, which he played in the school's team, and at which he had done well in the recent match. She wrote about the girls' reading, which had become a great pleasure, and who had read 2 books in the past week from the public library. She wrote about the garden, the potatoes she had dug last week, and which were stored in the cellar and should last well into the winter. The parsnips that were coming on well and would be ready after the first frosts, which brought out their sweetness. The cabbages that had done well this year, better than last. She wrote about the neighbour, who had had a difficult week. She did not say why, but the implication was clear to both the writer and the intended reader, and who had been managed with the specific combination of practical help and not too much inquiry that the situation required. She wrote about the queue at the grocer's, which had been long on Tuesday when a delivery of sugar had arrived, and the conversation she had had in the queue with the woman from the next street who had a sister in Australia. The sister in Australia had written, and Australia seemed very far away and very unremarkable in the best possible sense, removed from the war in a way that made its ordinariness seem remarkable. She did not write about the telegram boy she had seen on Thursday, turning into a gate 2 houses away. She had heard on Friday what the news was. She did not write about it. She wrote, at the end, that she was well, and that the children were well, and that she was looking forward to his next letter, and that she loved him. The letter was sealed. The words that were not in the letter remained in her, managed in the way she managed everything. His letter came the following Tuesday. The letter he had written 9 days before hers was received. He was well. The weather had been poor. The section had been in the support trench for the past week, which was better than the front line. He had been to the divisional concert, and it had been a reasonable evening. The food had been as expected. He was thinking of her. He was looking forward to the leave that he hoped might come in the autumn. He loved her. The letter read twice, then set in the box with the others, the connection maintained, the conversation continuing at a distance in the specific register of the wartime letter. And now the night is here, and the letters are in their box, and the connection they represent is the connection that lasts through the night, that lasts through the years, that lasts. Sleep now. Good night. The women's work in more detail. Let us stay a little longer with the work that Dorothy and women like her did. the housework. The housework of a terraced house in a provincial town in 1916 was not the housework of the modern household. There was no vacuum cleaner. Carpet sweepers existed, but were less effective than the 20th century's motorized successors. There was no washing machine. There was no dishwasher. The labor that these machines replaced was done by hand. The washing. Laundry was one of the more physically demanding of the regular household tasks. The weekly wash required the heating of water in the copper, a large fixed tub in the scullery, heated by a fire underneath, and the processing of the family's clothing and linen through soaking, rubbing, wringing and rinsing, then mangling, running through the hand-turned mangle to squeeze out the excess water, and drying. The wash took most of a day. Monday was traditionally washing day. The rhythm of the week organised around the wash day and the subsequent drying and ironing days. In a household with children, the volume of laundry was considerable. Dorothy did her own washing. In the pre-war household, there had sometimes been the help of a washerwoman, a woman who came in once a week to do the heavy laundry. The war had reduced this option. The washerwomen had found better paid work in the factories, and the extra expenditure that a wartime household might not easily justify. The ironing, done with the heavy flat irons heated on the range, was the Wednesday task. The dried laundry waiting in its folded state for the application of the iron that pressed it smooth. The cleaning. The house was swept and dusted on a regular schedule. The rooms swept, the grates cleaned. The range and the parlour fireplace needed their ash removed and their surfaces maintained. The furniture dusted, the floors scrubbed where they were not carpeted. This work was done on a rotating schedule. This room on this day, that room on another. The comprehensive weekly clean, the daily management of the most essential surfaces. The cooking was daily as we have described. The sewing and the mending, the clothes that wore and needed repair, the children's clothes that were outgrown and needed to be adjusted, the household linens that developed holes or thin patches and needed darning. The management of all of this, the scheduling and the prioritizing and the doing, was the domestic work of the household manager, done without credit, done as a matter of course, done because it needed doing, and she was the one who was there to do it. The exhaustion. At the end of a full day of this work, the tiredness was real, not the dramatic exhaustion of some kinds of physical labour, but the specific tiredness of sustained activity through a long day, the tiredness of someone who had been continuously doing since the morning. This tiredness was the condition of the sleep. As your tiredness is the condition of your sleep, the body that has been used through the day, that has its own specific evidence of the day's work in its tiredness, and the sleep that comes for it. Available. Now. Good night. The town's public life. The town's public life continued through the war, altered but not extinguished. The theatre. The local theatre, every provincial town of any size had one, continued its programme through the war with adjustments. The male actors had largely enlisted, and the casts were adjusted accordingly. The patriotic entertainment, the music hall acts and the comedy shows and the variety programmes that addressed the war with the specific combination of sentimentality and irony that the period produced, was well attended. Dorothy attended the theatre occasionally, taking the children for the seasonal pantomime that was one of the reliably popular entertainments, going sometimes in the evenings with a friend when a specific production warranted it. The theatre provided the specific experience of being in a large group of people sharing an entertainment, the communal experience of performance that the home's piano and the home's reading could not replicate, the laughter that a comedy produced, the specific social laughter of an audience, the shared response to the same thing, was the laughter of being in community, of being with others in the same place at the same time, which the wartime isolation of the household made more valuable, the public park. The town's public park was still available, still maintained to an extent, still used by the population for the Sunday afternoon walks and the summer picnics and the children's play. The park in wartime had acquired some additional functions. There might be a corner given over to the growing of vegetables, responding to the food production encouragement. There might be a space used for military drill or recruitment activities. But the park retained its primary character as the town's outdoor recreation space. Dorothy took the children to the park on Sunday afternoons when the weather allowed. The specific pleasure of the park's open space after the week's confinement to the house and the streets, the children running and playing in the way that children need to run and play, the library. The public library was free and provided books for the population that either could not afford to buy or did not need to own the books they read. Dorothy was a library user, as she had been before the war. The library in wartime had an increased patronage. The evenings that were spent at home rather than in the entertainments that required spending money were evenings that reading could fill, and the library provided the reading. The books that the library held, fiction and non-fiction, and reference, and the various categories, were borrowed and read and returned and borrowed again. The library also received donations of books for the troops at the front, organised by the various committee organisations. The books collected, sorted, packaged, and sent forward through the channels that got them to the reading soldiers. Dorothy donated books to this effort when she could spare them from me, her own shelf, the novels she had read and would not reread, the older editions of reference works that had been superseded, whatever could be given without impoverishing her own reading resources, the library in the morning after the children's school drop-off, the returning of last week's books, the selection of this week's, the specific pleasure of the browse, the looking through the shelves, the reading of the first page or two of something that might be the next read. The chosen books carried home, the evening's reading, and sleep. Good night. The small pleasures. The wartime life was not without its pleasures, and it would misrepresent it to describe only the difficulties. The cup of tea. We have discussed tea as the British military's morale factor, and the British civilian was equally committed. The cup of tea was made with whatever was available, and drunk with whatever sweetness the diminished sugar supply allowed, and it was still tea, and it was still its specific comfort that the British relationship to tea produces. The morning's first cup of tea in the kitchen before the children were up was Dorothy's specific morning pleasure, the quiet, the warmth of the cup, the specific moment of the day that was entirely her own before the household's demands began, the garden in summer. The garden in summer was a genuine pleasure. The work of the garden was real, but the garden in its productive fullness, the ants in flower, the potatoes coming into blossom, the specific beauty of the vegetable garden in the peak of its season, was its own reward. The garden in the early morning, when the dew was still on the leaves and the birds were busy, and the day had not yet made its demands. This was the specific pleasure of the summer morning, and it was available regardless of the war. The letter from him. The letter from her husband arriving in the post was one of the week's genuine pleasures. The sight of the handwriting on the envelope, the opening of it, the reading of his voice in the words. The news in the letter that he was well, that the section had been in the support trench rather than the front line, that he had had a good night's sleep for once, that the mail had finally caught up and he had received her letters and the parcel, was news she received with genuine pleasure. He was alive, he was managing, he was thinking of her. These were the basic facts that made everything else manageable. The children's laughter in the house, their jokes at the tea table, their stories from school, the specific comedy of childhood that produced the laughter that was the house's own medicine against the weight of the wartime. The children's laughter was real and reliable and unconnected to the war, the children's world having its own supply of the ridiculous and the delightful that the war could not entirely suppress. These pleasures existed alongside the difficulties. They were not compensation for the difficulties. They were simply present, simultaneously with the difficulties, part of the same life that the difficulties were part of. And the day that contained both pleasures and difficulties ended in the same sleep, the sleep that held everything, which is here for you now, as it was there for her, in the dark, in the quiet, the tea finished, the letter read, the children's laughter in the memory, and sleep, good night, the waiting for peace. At the end of 1916, the end of the war was not visible. The Battle of the Somme had ended in November with no decisive victory for either side. The enormous losses had not produced the breakthrough that had been hoped for. The war seemed as if it might go on indefinitely, and the specific exhaustion that this produced in the civilian population was one of the defining qualities of the middle years. The rhetoric of the war's early period, the confident assertion that it would be over quickly, the enthusiasm of the initial enlistments, the sense that the conflict was both just and manageable, had given way to something more weary and more honest. People still supported the war. The alternative, which was a German victory, was not considered acceptable. But the support was no longer the easy support of 1914. It was the patient, grinding support of people who understood that the cost was enormous and who continued because they saw no alternative. Dorothy's support for the war was of this character. She had never been an enthusiast in the 1914 mode. She had accepted that her husband needed to enlist, had accepted his absence with the practical courage of the person who accepts what must be accepted and manages accordingly. She had never doubted that the war needed to be fought, but she was tired of it. Not in the sense of being about to give up. She was not about to give up, and the notion of giving up was not something she entertained, but in the sense of the accumulated weight of 4 years of management under difficulty, the specific weariness of sustained effort over a long time. She was tired, and she was patient, and she continued. As the women of the First World War home front continued, all of them tired, all of them patient, all of them continuing, through the nights that gave them their sleep, and the days that demanded their management, and the evenings by the fire with the knitting and the letter and the book, and the sleep, and the morning, and the continuation, until November 1918, and the armistice, and the end that came, as it always came, after the long patience, after the long management, after the long waiting, The end, and you are at your own end, your day's end, not the end of a war, simply the end of your day, which also comes after the long patience and the long management, after the soup and the shopping and the letters and the knitting, after whatever your version of all of this was. The end, which is sleep, right here. Good night. The night holds everything. All the First World War home-front civilians, all the Dorothys and the Marthas and the Margarets and the Emilys, in all the terraced houses and the farmhouses and the tenement flats and the village cottages of Britain. All the French women managing the households that the absent men had left behind, in the cities untouched by the fighting and in the towns close to the front. All the German women standing in the turnip winter's queues, managing the most severe civilian privation of the Western powers. All the Russian women in the cities that would become revolutionary in 1917, managing on the edge of a social upheaval that was the war's most radical civilian consequence. All of them in their specific nights. All of them with the same body's need. All of them finding the same rest in whatever sleeping place was theirs, in the dark of their specific country and their specific town, the same dark, the same quiet, the same sleep, and you, here, now, in the same line, the long line of civilians who managed difficult times and found, at the end of each managed day, the sleep that the day's management had earned, the same sleep, available, here, now. Take it. The home fires kept burning, the letters written and received, the soup made, the children put to bed, the allotment tended, the socks knitted, the waiting done, and now, the rest, the full night's rest, unrationed, unlimited, available, yours. Sleep, good night,